Hey guys, this is what your pastor to tell you. Today we're going to part 5, which talks about the book of Jeremiah, whether it originated with God or the human authors. This is a weird question, and I hope you guys are going to enjoy this. So, he says, it's been pretty quiet at the Naked Bible. The last post on the multiple editions of Joshua didn't get much of a response. It's made me wonder about posting more edition problems, especially this one, but I promised. Again, the issue of the biblical books being edited during and after the exile is not a problem with respect to the view of inspiration I'm espousing here. We have incontrovertible evidence that the books were either edited well after the presumably original work was composed, or that books were together by editors for the first time after the prophet was dead and gone. That is, his material was either written piecemeal by himself or recorded by others, and then later fashioned into the book we have. I believe God was in this process, and that by providential means, his spirit oversaw the results of what the original authors and later editors did to produce the canonical books. We now turn to the most dramatic example of a biblical book in flux, sometime between the exile and the intertestamental period, the book of Jeremiah. We know that those chronological boundaries are appropriate, since Jeremiah lived shortly after the exile began, and since we have evidence for two dramatically different versions of the book at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, he says there's quite a bit of difference between the Masoretic text of Jeremiah. Of course, Masoretic text around 800 AD, the versions our Bibles are based on, and the Hebrew text underlying the Septuagint. Septuagint around 300, 200 AD to about 100 AD. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, and so Jeremiah in this discussion. In the Bible quoted most often by the New Testament writers, the Septuagint of Jeremiah is about 1/8 shorter than the Masoretic text of Jeremiah. You heard that right. So we have, and you can check out other videos in my library of long list of videos. We have Jesus, other writers, Paul specifically, quoting a lot from the Septuagint, but the Septuagint is different than the text we have today, or the text we use. So what do we do with that? He says, since the book of Jeremiah is so long, this amounts to hundreds of verses and thousands of words. Additionally, the order of the chapters differs, and material within the chapters also differs in order. The following chart illustrates the chapter order divergence. So we have Masoretic text, we have chapter 1:1 to 25:13a, so it's same in the Septuagint. Then the Masoretic text is chapters 25:14 to 46:5, so it's a good chunk. But then Septuagint, it goes right to chapters 46 to 51. But then the Masoretic text, it's kind of in order. It goes from 46 to 51:64. Then the Septuagint, after going from 46 to 51, jumps back to chapter 25. Then it reads chapters 15 to 34, or 31, verse 34. And then it ends in chapter 52. So they both end in chapter 52. That's really fascinating. Just right off the bat, my guess is that we're going to see one writer, or what seems to be one writer, adding things in the middle, but then keeping the front and the back. That's really fascinating. He says, let's think about first the ramifications of this data. Certainly the Septuagint is not to be considered superior or preferable in all instances where it differs from the Masoretic text. The reasoning is because they say some crazy things. However, the remains of many Hebrew texts at Qumran agree with Septuagint against the Masoretic text. A good number of those instances also coincide with New Testament quotations. Remember, Masoretic text, the one that most of our translations are based on, much, much later. This makes sense that we would have some verses that have been essentially changed or added or removed or whatever, since it's so much earlier. And then he says, and so we know that the New Testament writers used or preferred the Septuagint against Masoretic text in those places. In fact, many specialists estimate that roughly 3/4 of the time a New Testament author quoted the Old Testament, the quotation matches or is closer to Septuagint than Masoretic text. All this means is that we can't just write off the Septuagint and say, well, we'll just go with the Masoretic text. That's an LTIC. Lastly, if Septuagint is the better version or edition, or is even better half the time, then it could be argued that the Bible used in the English only reading world also has a lot of added material in it. In reality, though, claims like this version or that version is the best version can't be made with coherence since we aren't omniscient. We just can't know how the version issue, which one was the final edit, can be resolved. For evangelical scholars who have facility with Greek and Hebrew, it's a non-issue since scholars work hard to come to their own decisions based by passage as to what was the most likely original. This is called text criticism. Fortunately, more recent translations are starting to go with the Dead Sea Scroll and Septuagint readings in the running text, which helps English readers have more confidence that their translations reflect the final form of the books of the Bible. So it's really interesting that he says that it makes people more confident, because I think it does for a lot of people, but obviously like people like the King James only people, it doesn't. It brings insecurities. It's like you're changing the Bible. Of course, the misconception there is that the people that are, quote unquote, changing the Bible are really trying to do what they should be doing, which is, making sure that the earliest texts, the ones that are more authentic, ones that are more probable that they were in the original text, those ones are, what we're actually using in our Bibles today. Unfortunately, though, this hasn't been done with Jeremiah since the results would frighten uninitiated pastors and laity, so we just live with Masoretic text for completely pragmatic reasons. That is fascinating. That is just fascinating that these biblical translators, or yes, they're being paid money, but they might lose it if they remove parts of Jeremiah or whatever, but at the same time, like, this is serious stuff. Like, this is, people are relying their faith on this. Like, we really want to make sure that we give the authentic text. Before concluding, I should note that it isn't only Jeremiah and Joshua that differ in order of material and significant amount of content. There are other books where evidence of more than one version exists. For instance, Septuagint Job is about 1/6 smaller than Masoretic text Job. 1/6 smaller. That means either something was definitely added or something was definitely taken out sometime along the way, and includes an ending not extant in Masoretic text Hebrew, and almost half of the verses in Septuagint Esther are not found in Masoretic text Esther. Wow, that is half? That is a lot. This is the kind of real-world data that God alone statements of inspiration ignore. There is no sense in denying anthroponostos, and it seems dishonest to do so with respect to such data. Having humans as the immediate but not ultimate source of the biblical text is far more coherent. It gives pride of place to theonostos, which is, God breathed, without denying reality or claiming omniscience. This is why I think it is nonsensical to ignore the data in favor of something like the Westminster Confession. Confessions are worthwhile, but they are historically circumcised. I'm no expert in Septuagint studies, but I'm guessing the authors of the Confession may have not known much about these issues, or even the Septuagint. The Septuagint was certainly known in antiquity, but the loss of Greek in Europe and all but the monasteries until the Renaissance may have meant that few scholars before the 19th century did much work in the Septuagint. He says, I'm not a Septuagint expert, so I don't know for sure whether they didn't know or didn't care. It's hard for me to understand how we should care more about a 17th century confession articulates inspiration than how contemporary scholars equally committed to inspiration would handle the issue. Wow, that's crazy. So what we see here is, one, we see a lot of craziness happening in Job, Esther, Jeremiah. And two, we also have this idea that Heiser is trying to, argue that, we should pay attention to Septuagint. It's a much earlier text. It probably has some more accurate verses or passages that were, more authentic than, what we're using in the Masoretic text, which was what, like 1,000 years later when it was written. But anyways, so last subject here is he's talking about the Westminster Confession. This is, of course, an interesting subject because there are a lot of people that almost act as if it's inspired. Like you have the Bible up here, and then you have the Westminster Confession right here, and then you have any other scholars right here, which it doesn't really make much sense to say. Like, why would we think that, considering the people that wrote the Westminster Confession, they weren't inspired. They said themselves they weren't inspired. They were just writing on what data they had the best, and trying to use logic. But they were also biased. They also lived in a culture that produced certain thought. There were certain popular views then that would be ridiculous today, and that's something we need to be really paying attention to, because they didn't care. It doesn't seem like they cared or even knew about Septuagint. So if they didn't have all the information, or they weren't using all the information, we should be confident that they didn't have all of the best arguments, because they didn't have the data to make the best arguments. Compare that today, when we have computers that do word analysis. We've got a whole range of craziness of texts outside the Bible that give us a better understanding of what the Bible says. We are living in an amazing age when we have so much information. We almost a lot of times don't even know what to do with it. Not only that, but we have tons of scholars that are constantly writing and coming up with new ideas and learning more about how we have the text. So anyways, this has been awesome. A couple posts ago, we gave an applause for everybody. I think we should do that, except for just want to thank my family and my friends, because couldn't be possible without us. So anyways, here's a goal. You guys, you're all doing great. You watching too. Never mind. We'll give it another applause for you. Another applause for the people watching. This is an awesome time. Anyways.